In this video, I want to look at strategies for reading material. So we can look at things like your textbook, maybe lecture notes provided by your instructor, and we'll see some commonalities. Let's start with the textbook. Most textbooks have their chapters organized into sections. As we can see on the right, here's an example of a textbook. We can see there's section headers, and then there's like subsections. You can use these to kind of start your reading by previewing them. So like you could look at either the table of contents, or you could just kind of flip through the chapter of a textbook and see the different section headings and subsection headings. And doing this first, it kind of gives you an overview of what's to come. Now obviously it's not going to give you information you would need for a test, but it gives you kind of an understanding of the organization. And what I'd encourage you to do is look at the connection between these things. You can also see this by looking at how either I or other instructors organize any notes we give you. We don't just kind of do it haphazardly. There's usually some kind of organizing structure. And if you can kind of look at that and get a grasp of how your instructor, or in this case a textbook author, organizes the information, it can help you see the connections between different pieces of information. And I think it can also help you understand how to maybe organize your own notes and thinking about a certain topic. Next, we can look at learning objectives. In all courses, there are some learning objectives. Sometimes they're like overall general objectives for the course, but a lot of times there's also ones for a specific chapter. And think about those might be either given to you by your instructor, or they might be embedded in a textbook. Here's an example of ones that are in a textbook. Here it says that by the end of this section you will be able to, and it goes on and describes 4 things that you should be able to do. So you can think about using learning objectives as a way to kind of test your understanding. You can say, okay, I've read this section, now I want to go back to learning objectives. Can I do these things? For example, can I describe areas of the brain involved in sleep? Can I understand, or do I understand hormone secretions associated with sleep? And if you're having difficulty with that, a lot of times textbooks will actually either tell you this focuses on a certain learning objective, or it might repeat the learning objective. But if not, you can just kind of use those and kind of guide your reading. So think about, as you're reading through a section, think about those learning objectives. What information is being provided that can help you with that? Now, I'm not saying that I or any other instructor is just going to use these learning objectives and write a test, but it does give you a way to kind of check your understanding as you go. So they really can be useful. Of course, an important thing with studying is vocabulary terms. And in psychology, there's been research done looking at introduction to psychology, and that in that course, the research has found that there's as many vocabulary terms as there is in a foreign language course, which sounds overwhelming, but think about textbooks, and I'll use my own lecture notes as an example. You can tell the vocabulary terms because I have them in bold, italics, and a shade of green. So I do that to kind of help you pick them out. So we'll see some textbooks, they just do it in bold. As we can see in this example, sleep rebound is in bold. Other textbooks have not only the vocabulary terms in bold, but they have the term and a short definition in the margins. Now, not all books have those. Why not? It kind of depends upon the author, of how they wrote the book. It might also depend upon the format. The first example I showed you was from an online textbook that's free, and because of that, sometimes you don't get some of those formatting features. The second example is from a major textbook publisher, and it's a printed version, and so we can see that sometimes the publisher can do things you can't necessarily do in free books or online books. You could do this. It just takes more HTML programming, and sometimes people who put those what are called OERs, Open Educational Resources, together, like the textbook I use for Introduction to Psychology and the textbook I use for Developmental Psychology. They're both OERs. They're both free textbooks to students. But the people who put them together didn't have this ability, and also sometimes it makes it longer. Think about how much bigger your textbook is if you have to take this much space out of the text for things like this. As I've mentioned in other places, when you're studying vocabulary terms, there's kind of three parts to it, or maybe three steps you could think. The first is, of course, explain the vocabulary term in your own words. So when you read a definition like we have here for senile plaques, take a look at what it says and then put it in your own words, because it's going to mean more to you. Just memorizing a textbook definition isn't going to help you if you don't understand it. I like to use the example of most people throughout school have memorized the equation E equals mc squared, Einstein's famous formula. But having that memorized doesn't do you any good if you don't know what it means or how to use it. I understand what it means, but I have no idea how to use it because I haven't taken a lot of physics. Another example, in chemistry in high school, I learned Avogadro's number, which is 6.02 times 10 to the negative 23rd power. Well, I've got that memorized, and I can tell you it's the weight of a mole, but I don't know anything else about it. I have no idea how I would use that. And you might say, why did you memorize it? I only memorized it because our high school teacher made a big deal about it. She invited us over to her house at 6:02 on October 23rd for dinner. And we had a big celebration for Avogadro's number. So I remembered it, but it's not information that can do me any good because I don't remember how to use it. So going back to what I was suggesting, the first thing is, can you explain this vocabulary term in your own words? That's going to be helpful to you. Then, can you go back and translate? So take your definition of, in this case, senile plaques, and compare it to how the textbook defines it. Can you do a translation back and forth? By translation, I mean, can you see the connection between your understanding and wording of a definition and an academic version? Obviously, academic versions are more polished and they use more jargon than your definition does. Doesn't mean your definition is wrong, but can you go back and forth? Why is that important? Think about when you take a test. Most tests are worded in academic writing, and so you'd have to be able to understand this. Now you'll use your own definition just to help you understand the concept, but again, you have to be able to go back and forth, and that's where the third step comes into, is either create or find an example of that term, and if possible, from your own life. Now, in this case, the example I've been using, senile plaques, that's probably not going to happen, be something from your own life, unless you know somebody who has Alzheimer's. But if most things in psychology are things that we all experience, and so if you can think of an example from your own life, that's great. If you can't, use one that maybe your instructor gave you or the textbook gave you, and kind of analyze that example. Why does that example demonstrate that concept? And if you can do that, it's going to make it a richer definition. It's going to be much easier for you to access at test time, because you can go back and forth between the academic wording and everyday wording, and you can think of an example and you understand how that example works. Another point we can look at is how much coverage is given to a topic. At this, let's look at this example I have on the screen. Here we're looking at a coverage of, back up. Think about first the amount of coverage given to a topic. Think about it in a textbook. How much space is actually given to explaining a certain concept? Or if your instructor provides lecture notes like I do, how much time was spent covering that? And so if both the textbook and the lecture notes spend quite a bit of time discussing a topic, then you can assume it's an important topic to know. On the other hand, if your textbook does not spend much time on a topic, but your instructor's notes do, then it's probably important because your instructor is taking time to supplement the textbook. A third possibility is if your textbook covers a topic in sufficient detail, but the lecture notes your instructor gives you do not. Well, there's two possible interpretations of this. The first one could be your instructor doesn't view it as that important, and that's why there wasn't much coverage of that topic. Now, the other possibility is your instructor feels your textbook does a good job of explaining a topic, and so therefore they don't feel that they need to spend the time going over it because the textbook did a good job. Now, of course, which one of these is true in your case? You don't know. So don't be afraid to ask your instructor. So think about, if you don't know, ask me. I'll tell you if I think something's important. Now keep in mind, the way your instructor views important is probably different than the way you do. Most students see it as important as, will it be on the test? An instructor is looking not at what's on the test, but an instructor is looking at, what do we want you to come away from the course understanding? And so when they say it's important, that doesn't always necessarily mean to be a test, because again, think about, we don't just look at what's on the test. And in my case, for my online courses, I have Canvas set up to randomly pick questions from a bank of questions. Thus, I don't always know what questions each student's going to get. Each student's going to get it's going to randomly pick for each student. So I don't know what questions you're going to get, so I can't really tell you what's on the test. So let's go back to this example I have on the screen. This is a excerpt from a textbook that's discussing the sensory development of infants. So let's compare the coverage for each sense to determine what's most important. We can see there's quite a bit of information about vision and hearing. But when we look at touch and pain, there's not as much, and there's quite a bit about taste and smell. So you could assume from this that touch and pain may not be as an important topic because the textbook didn't spend as much time talking about it. And if to give you a little insight, we are more concerned about vision and hearing because that's kind of the way we learn. Most of the information we learn, we either see it or we hear it. Those are kind of two major senses. So it makes sense that your textbook doesn't cover touch and pain as much. Let's look at some other things. Textbooks typically have what I'm going to call comprehension aids. It's not really the official name for them, but I think it'll work in this case. In our first example, notice that you're referred to a website. So in this little section separated by red dashed lines, it says to explore your individualist versus collectivist self, engage online with access your strengths. What is your self-concept? So you're given a link to go someplace else. I would encourage you to do that. Whenever you have a textbook that tells you to go to a certain website, take advantage of that. And the main reason being is because you might learn something more about the topic. And in this same example, if we look above that section, we'll see that the textbook asks a question. What do you think of people who willingly change their behavior to suit different people and situations? The fact that the textbook is asking you a question is something you can use to check your understanding. So after you read this section, think about, can you go back and answer that question? So textbooks a lot of times put these little aids in here to help you understand. So by asking this question, I also encourage people, if you're taking a face-to-face class or even an online class, if your instructor asks questions either in the materials they provide or in a face-to-face class, I would encourage you to write down those questions. The fact that they asked the question probably means it's something important they want you to understand. Another type of comprehension aid is a figure. So a figure is gives you a little bit more of an example that demonstrates a concept. And then the example I have on the screen, this figure talks about culture and context effects. So sometimes students see okay, it's not part of the main text. I'm going to skip it. I'm not going to read it because I got things to do. I would encourage you to look at those. The fact that the textbook put these in there, it's because they felt this might be a concept that's difficult to understand, and they're providing you with some kind of a greater aid. Like in this case, they have a picture, and then they ask you questions or they tell you about how people interpret this picture differently. And so this might really help you understand this topic of culture and context effects in a way that maybe just reading the textbook doesn't. And think about whenever you see things like figures, tables, graphs, learn to interpret those. Because when you get into your upper level classes at a 4-year college, you're going to be expected to know how to interpret those things. And a lot of times they convey a lot of information that isn't always evident in the text. Let's look at a third example. This excerpt from a textbook has a conversation between a therapist and a client. Now above this little section we see that by looking at the section header, that this section is talking about identifying negative thinking and biases. Some people will just either skip over this or just read through it and move on. But don't just read through it. Actually try to analyze it. And when you read this conversation, what you find is that this dialogue is an example of a conversation between a therapist and a client demonstrating the concept of automatic thoughts. Now that you know it's about automatic thoughts, think about how does this demonstrate automatic thinking? If you can do that, that's going to improve your critical thinking skills, and it also might help you understand the concept of automatic thinking. The last thing we're going to do in this video is go over graphs a little bit to help you understand graphs, because a lot of students see a graph in a textbook and it's like, that looks too complicated. I'm not even going to bother trying to figure that out. I'll just skip over it. Again, graphs contain a lot of information. So let's look at this graph on the screen. At first it looks pretty complex. There's a lot going on here, and it is a complex graph, but it isn't something that you can't understand. So the first thing we're going to look at is, let's look at, we know that this graph is talking about sleep, and it's looking at sleep across the lifespan, because we have a section over here for infancy, one for childhood, one for adolescence, and one for adulthood and old age. We also see us looking at how many hours a person sleeps during the day. As we can see, it goes clear up to 24, because obviously there's 24 hours in a day. So if you look at the top of the REM sleep section, the section we have here in pink, This gives you the total amount of sleep. And that's what can be kind of confusing about a graph like this, because what we can see is if we start off with infants who are 1 to 15 days old. If we look at the top of this graph, top of REM sleep, we can see overall that infants at this age sleep about 16 hours a day. Now if we move down the graph in that same area, we can see that they spend a total of, we could say, roughly 7 hours in non-REM sleep. So if you want to know how much REM sleep do they have, well, you just got to subtract 7 from 16 and you get 9. So you can see they spend 9 hours in REM sleep and 7 hours in non-REM sleep for a total of 16 hours. So that's quite a bit of information. And now if we look at adults who are 31 to 45 years of age, if we look at them, we can see they spend roughly 6.5 hours of total sleep. And 5 of those hours are in non-REM sleep. So we have about an hour and a half of REM sleep. So we can see it's different. Now if we think about, could we do some comparison, what we also notice is if we look at the overall amount of sleep, we see that the overall amount of sleep decreases as we age. And we also see, whoops, didn't mean to click the mouse. We also see that the amount of REM sleep decreases over the lifespan. That when you're an infant, you have a lot of REM sleep. But as you go through childhood and then through adulthood, it decreases. The same is true with non-REM sleep. So there's a lot of information that's conveyed in here. And taking the time to figure this out really will help you understand, in this case, how much sleep people engage in. Here's another example. We have this bar graph that's looking at a variety of things. So first we need to understand what this graph is looking at. Now obviously if you were reading this in a textbook, it'd have a title and it would tell you. But what I can tell you is this graph is looking at the relation between genetics and schizophrenia. And what we're going to see is we start off here at the very top. We see it's looking at monozygotic twins. Now what they mean by that is if one twin has schizophrenia, what are the chances that the other one will as well? So what are the chances that both monozygotic twins or identical twins have schizophrenia? Well, we can see it's roughly maybe 47%. And then if we look at the offspring of two parents who have schizophrenia, so both parents have schizophrenia and they have a child, what are the chances that child has schizophrenia? And we see it's over 45%, maybe 46%. Then we look at dizygotic twins or fraternal twins. We see the percentage drops quite a bit. So maybe now we're at maybe 16, 17%. And then if you notice, one thing we're seeing is as the degree of shared DNA decreases, so does the chance of having schizophrenia. So it does say, so one conclusion is we need to look at what's our comparison rate. So down the very bottom of the graph, we see the general population. So we can see that the chance of having schizophrenia in the general population is maybe around 2%. So it's very small. But as we go up this chart, we see that the more DNA you share with somebody else, the more likely you are to have it. So it does suggest that genetics does play a role. But we have a secondary conclusion. This isn't the only conclusion. We also notice that we got two identical twins. So they share pretty much 99% the same DNA, if not 100%. But the chance of them having schizophrenia isn't 100%. So that a secondary conclusion from this graph is that genetics alone does not explain why people have schizophrenia. Because if it did, monozygotic twins would be at 100%. So the point of this is a graph that again looks complex, but it contains a lot of information and it can really help you understand the concept, something that maybe you wouldn't get by reading the text. There is a problem with this graph, of course, and the problem is if you look at the x-axis, if you look at the values, it goes from 0% to 50%. It should go to 100% because we're trying to look at the whole population. There's 100% of the population, and they more than likely did this in a textbook just to conserve space and to show you the differences. But the problem is when you don't use the full value of the scale, it distorts it and it makes it look like it's a huge percentage. We'll see an example in the next slide. So here we have two graphs. The graph on the left and the graph on the right are exactly the same, but they don't look the same. If we look at the graph on the left, it's talking, again, both graphs talking about the anxiety about sexual performance between males and females, also looking by age group. But this one only goes up to 20%, and the one on the right goes up to 100%. Well, we're looking at 100% of the population. We're not looking at only 20%. And so if you notice how much difference we see if we look at, let's just take the biggest example. So here we have anxiety about sexual performance between males and females who are aged 40 to 49. And we see the difference is males have 19% of males have anxiety about sexual performance compared to only 11% of females. That difference looks huge in this graph. But if we go over here, it doesn't quite look as big, does it? And so that's why whenever you're creating a graph, it really should be at the highest possible point. So like let's say you're looking at temperature. You need to have the whole scale. So like if we're looking at body temperature of humans, I mean you wouldn't have to have like 1,000 degrees because we know we can't get that high, but you'd have to have something that's possible to get a better idea of the comparison. Our final graph is what's called a grouped bar graph. And a grouped bar graph represents related sets of data. So each set of data is graphed separately but on the same graph. So you kind of got two things going on here. First, notice that this graph does contain 100% because we're looking at the percentage of people in prison. Well, we're looking at 100% of all the people in prison. What is the percentage of people who are either psychopaths or non-psychopaths? So by grouping, it does two things, and we saw this on the previous slide as well. Here we have one group. We can look at age groups. So 16 to 20, 21 to 25. These people are grouped by age. And then within that group, we can look at, are they a psychopath or are they a non-psychopath? So first we could look at just, if we look at the kind of, I don't know, dark orange bars that represent psychopaths, we can see that overall there tends to be more psychopaths who are in prison. Then if we look at the non-psychopaths, we can see, well, it depends upon, we can look at the differences in age. We can see there's less of them, of course. And then we can also look at age groups. First of all, we can see which age groups are the highest represented in the population. Now, if you notice along the x-axis, we don't have all age ranges. It's starting at 16 and it's ending at 45. In this case, we don't need to include the whole age range because first of all, children are not going to be in prison, so we wouldn't need to include those. And we could not include the elderly because maybe in this type of research they're only looking at a certain group. So there are times you don't have to include everything. Now you could, but it just depends what they were looking at. Maybe they were only concerned about that. And another reason in this case why you're not seeing the whole age range, there is a valid reason. And one is that antisocial personality disorder, which is where this is kind of coming from, decreases with age, and so there's less people. So when you're in late adulthood, you're less likely to have to do something that's going to get you in prison if you have that disorder. So I hope all this kind of helped you understand how to go about reading your textbook and also looking at graphs.